Welcome to the afternoon set of sessions. My name is Phillip Cornell. I'm the Global Practice Lead at Economist Impact for Energy and Sustainability. And it's really a privilege to be hosting this panel today on circularity and circular impact working within your supply chain. This is going to be a slightly different panel in that we're calling it a how-to panel. So it's really looking at specific cases from the organizations of the panelists here of how they've adopted circularity into supply chains or how within their own contexts are thinking about these issues. So I'm really happy to introduce to my left Eva Karlsson, who's the Chief Executive of Houdini Sportswear, Abe Eshkenazi, who's the Chief Executive of the Association for Supply Chain Management, Natalia Agüeros-Macario, who's Director of ESG Strategy and Engagement for Umicore, Hanno Bruemmer, who's Executive Vice President and Head of Supply Chains and Logistics in EMEA, Africa, Latin America for Covestro, and Kevin Latner, who's Vice President of the Leather and Hide Council of America. Obviously, this is a really important topic. Shifting global supply chains to circularity can be very difficult. So we want to talk about how this can happen in a cost-effective and meaningful way, speaking about steps to work with suppliers, how this can be funded, thinking about things like product design, particularly from our materials manufacturers, system design, behavior change, and policy. But first, let me kick off with a series of case studies that each of our presenters will offer. And maybe if I can just turn to my left first to Eva to kick us off.
Yes,
thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me. And it's difficult to decide on a case. It's very complex, our work, but so this is it. I work for a Swedish outdoor brand, Houdini Sportswear. And when we look at circularity, the definition we choose to take is that we want to create a system that is similar to the natural system. So nature is our blueprint. It means that we have an ambition of having a circular flow of raw materials, a circular flow of products, and then a circular flow of knowledge and insights, so open source in that sense. And the way we do it, and one of the most important frameworks that we use is the Planetary Boundaries Framework. What the Planetary Boundaries Framework helps us with is, of course, drive in terms of urgency, but also a science-based systems perspective. Not only carbon, for instance. We have to realize that moving towards circular, we have the opportunity and responsibility not only to address carbon, but biodiversity, land system, ocean. And the cool thing about circularity is that you can address all 9 boundaries. I don't know if you're aware of the Planetary Boundaries Framework, but those 9 boundaries, instead of only addressing one, if you look at carbon, we address all 9. And that's the benefits of circularity, if you work with circularity in a systemic perspective as well. And the way we do that is looking at product design and material designs, monomaterial designs, for instance, circulating clean chemistry rather than poisons. And then looking at not only production and design, but also consumption, extending product lifetime to the maximum, address enabling access rather than ownership, so through circular business models of different sorts that we've been exploring more than a decade. And then the power of design, last but not least, in product design is customer behavior, or moving from a linear way of using things to circular. It's actually something that we have been doing user service of, so that we can see that the power of product design enables and encourages users to become circular. It's not about regulations in that sense, but we can actually design products that last instead of 10 times, which is average in the apparel industry, which is crazy, of course, in the Western world, to more than 1,000 times, just by product design. And then Planetary Boundaries as a framework, that is my my absolute recommendation to work with as a science-based framework for circularity.
Can you give me an example, for example, on the product design side, where one of your products in particular, where you've extended this lifetime, on what basis?
So monomaterial design is one thing, so that the recycled or organic materials that go into a product, they stay pure in the way they're processed, but then they're mixed with other fabrics that are similar, so that they maintain their monomaterial purity, so that it's a closed loop that is efficient, energy efficient, and clean, enabling us to have the same raw material quality in the second and third and so forth. That is one thing, but when it comes to product versatility and longevity, we have we do user service to understand how our products are used. So not only designed for long life, but actually enabling and I guess making it intuitively attractive to extend product life. So we help with repairs, care. We sell and buy or provide selling and buying secondhand, remake, and of course all that as well. But and then subscription and rental. So it's a holistic, user-centric business model where access is one alternative.
Fabulous. Thanks, Eva. Abe, your association is all about supply chain managers. How are they looking at these questions?
Like sustainability is nobody knows what they're doing right now. 4 or 5 years ago, nobody even understood the term supply chain. The pandemic changed that dramatically. Prior to the pandemic, we were a very efficient system. Just-in-time was the hallmark of almost every organization. Rapid delivery, reasonable cost, high variety. E-commerce was still burgeoning. I think we're still trying to get back to just-in-time. We're in the just-in-case, higher inventories, a lot of buffer right now. But the pandemic exposed a number of latent issues within supply chain. 3 of them specifically from our perspective. First was visibility. Second was transparency, and the third was traceability. So supply chain professionals are inherent problem solvers. You give them a problem, and more often than not, they're only called when there's a problem, never when the perfect order arrives. So the challenge that we had with visibility is that we did not have tremendous insight into our tiers beyond our tier 1 supplier. And where most of the disruptions occurred were in tier 2, tier 3. So we worked very hard over the last 3 to 4 years through technology and talent. We've addressed the visibility gap. No supply chain professional can go into their organization now and say, I don't know who or what is in my supply chain. So that's really good news. We now know all the players and we now know all the activities. Here's the really bad news. We now know all the players and we now know all the activities within our supply chains. And so we've now, embedded responsibility on sustainability into supply chain professionals that they were never trained for. That this was not part of their core training, if they even had a formal training in supply chain. So that was first, is getting them competent and capable to address the sustainability issue. Secondly, I think we all have to understand that supply chains are designed based on demand. They are not some ethereal or some activity that's designed outside of the consumer or the end buyer in mind. They're designed to address demand. And we've heard from Exxon, we've heard a whole lot on the consumer and his or her responsibility. I think we have to first take a look at the organization in terms of the role and responsibility of the Chief Supply Chain Officer, working with the Chief Sustainability Officer, working with the CFO and the Compliance Officer. Because the second issue that we are trying to address right now is transparency, accurate, relevant, real-time data. And what we're finding is that visibility into tier 2, tier 3, small and medium-sized organizations, they no longer have the competency, they don't have the technology, and they don't have the resources to provide the kind of data that's necessary. We're working, trying to get that transparency to understand that information flow so that we can be clear on what true demand is, so we can rebalance that supply and demand equation. We're not there. We're still out of balance relative to demand because of the signals being significantly variable right now. And so the role and responsibility of the chief supply chain officer right now has changed dramatically over the past 3 to 4 years to take on a role that they were never trained for, nor are there any metrics or consistent body of knowledge to point to and say, here's the processes that you follow to ensure that you are sustainable. Pick the industry, you're going to have different metrics, you're going to have different standards. So unfortunately, we're not dealing with consistent metrics that we all need to apply. There's GRI, there's the UN Global Compact. There's a number of them out there. I think we need consensus on
maybe even the resilient supply chain benchmark.
Absolutely.
The Economist Impact has done some research together with you.
In 2020, we realized that a lot of organizations were, really unsure about what they do with the pandemic. Do we go back to where we were, or do we spring forward and say that we're never going back to where we were? And it was about a 50-50 split in terms of organizations, in terms of getting me back to where I was prior to the pandemic. And 50% of the organizations said, we're never going back. We need to fundamentally change the way that we operate as an organization. The other thing that we found with the research that we did with the Economist was that approximately 60 to 70% of Scope 3 emissions are within the supply chain. Less than 50% of the organizations have indicated the impact that it has on their organization. Less than 40% even have measures to indicate what their targets are for their organization. We have a significant say-do gap. When we asked them what their top priorities are, sustainability came out top 3. Unfortunately, when we took a look at the investment, it's at the bottom of the list. Our most recent trends identified that sustainability had dropped to number 9 out of 10, down from number 7. I think a number of things that we heard this morning about, greenwashing and hushwashing, and it's occurring at an operational level because you can't define it appropriately for these individuals. So we've got a significant gap right now within the supply chain in terms of how it addresses not only sustainability, but how it works on compliance, because that's the last issue that most organizations are facing right now, is that as you embed digital transformation in your organization to get accurate, relevant, real-time data, you're having to do it across your enterprise, not just tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. Small, medium-sized organizations that don't have the same standards or compliance that you do as an organization. So as we're enabling organizations to get the data, we're also exposing them to much higher risk on cyber, as well as ransomware and ransom attacks. And that is occurring almost on a daily basis for organizations right now.
Yeah. Just a quick one. You talked about, for example, supply chains being driven by the end user and demand. That really gives the impression of sort of a linear model. Just specifically on the circularity thing, are supply chain managers considering, or taking or assuming responsibility or given responsibility for bringing that back to the beginning of the chain again?
Yeah, a really interesting point, because I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the SCORE model, Supply Chain Operations Reference Model, by far and away the most referenced supply chain design for organizations right now. We just embedded circularity and resiliency and sustainability within the metrics. The unfortunate part is that it's not being consistently applied within the organizations right now. We're looking for that consistency for organizations, but they don't have anything to apply it to. Measured against what? Internal metrics versus external metrics versus industry metrics. We can't even get industries to agree on what those appropriate metrics are. And so we're having a significant gap right now in terms of the information. And I think everybody would like to get there, but we're significantly gapped right now.
Eventually, we're going to get to Kevin and talk a little bit about specifically this stuff. But before that, I'd like to turn to Natalia. We heard already from Eva the importance on the material side and the design of materials that are inputs to a lot of these questions. Can you please tell us a little bit about your case study of circularity within your company?
Sure. So I work at Umicore. We're a circular materials technology company. So it's cheating a little bit. We already got circularity in there. The company exists as a radical decision in terms of changing the business model, where circularity was at the heart of the business that we do. We have 4 business groups, and one of them is this recycling business group that takes in like 200 different types of complex wastes, right? And that feeds that in to the other business groups to produce things like materials for batteries that go into electric vehicles, materials that go into fuel cells, and other specialty material applications. And it's all metals based. And I was also struggling to think of like one example to give, but so The one that I picked has to do with sort of a standout success around our battery recycling business. We were among the first, if not the first, to have an industrial scale plant for recycling automotive batteries several years ago. And immediately we were faced with a challenge because the batteries that we would be recycling are still in all the cars that are driving, right? And so what do? Well, in speaking with our customers, right, we find out, and maybe you know this, but on average today across the industry, 1 in 3 batteries is scrap. Doesn't meet the criteria to be able to go into a car. So what do? We take these scrap batteries and recycle them to deliver battery quality materials back to our customers, right? And in that process, in that interaction with the customer, right, suddenly we're both supplier and customer. We're also having conversations with them about battery design for dismantling. And recycling is a big term that gets used for a lot of things. Sometimes it's shredding, and sometimes it's burning things down, sometimes it's just breaking things apart. But really having conversations with cell makers and battery makers on how they can design their batteries to maximize the output in terms of recycling is something that we're able to do. And so we like to think, I know the topic today is about supply chains, but at Umicore, when we talk about this, we talk about business ecosystems, where this traditional concept of on one hand you have your customer, on the other hand you have your supplier. We like to think about, well, all of these organizations can be both our customers and our suppliers, as can we, right? And to think about where are there opportunities to work on developing new things to lower impact, but also to strengthen the business that we have together, right? Because there is no sustainable business without business. And so rethinking a little bit these interactions in these business ecosystems is really, really important.
Great, thank you so much. And I think that's a great segue into Hanno. Obviously, Covestro is obviously a global polymers business, so very much at sort of in that material side, but you're also very involved in the circularity of that supply chain. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience, please?
Yeah, sure. No, thanks. Good opportunity to move also in the value chains. Now, I always like to say, okay, we are in the beginning of many of the products that we're all using because we provide, let's say, the chemicals for materials. Now, usually I can say we're all sitting on it. We're actually not sitting on it, but you are sitting on it because there's polyurethane and you're touching our polycarbonates on your cell phone. So our circularity strategy has 3 major pillars. And we've launched that a couple of years ago, really with a vision to become fully circular. What does it mean? First part is energy, because we have a huge energy consumption, because we make high energy molecules that we then provide into the polymers. So that's almost the easy part because we keep buying renewable energy. Of course, it needs to be available, but on the other hand, that's straightforward, doesn't change it. The second part is already more complex because we are changing the raw material space. So we're getting maybe all the intermediates we get from the petrochemical industry from new sources, but they still might be the same product. So it's about the new source coming from a sugar, coming from a recycled material, coming from fats, whatever, but still the process doesn't change. It's just handling all these new materials because before you had 1, 2, 3 qualities, now you end up in a vast majority of qualities and then mixing them all together. That's why we need something we call the mass balance approach. So you can really, let's say, track where is your material with what footprint, similar to when you source, let's say, green energy at your house. No, it's a mass balance certification approach. And then the third one is also bringing all these materials back. It used to be they end up in waste. Now we're bringing them back. Many of those materials you cannot recycle classically by mechanical recycling because it's a foam. Mm-hmm. So you have to go into chemistry again, break up the polymer, make something else, and then you can bring it back. So that chemical recycling creates also new supply chains that didn't exist before. And they're actually in the verge of classical product supply chain, but also in waste supply chains with different laws, different suppliers, all kinds of a different new ballgame. Not to make it too complicated. So
it sounds very much what Eva was talking about as well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, particularly on this sort of like chemical.
Yeah. So we're tackling that from both sides. But also, on top of it, of course, the supply chain as such, we try to make more sustainable. It's not the biggest portion. When you look at our Scope 3, of course, the majority of our Scope 3, which Scope 3 is already 80% of our carbon footprint, and 75% of that is the raw materials. And let's say classical logistics is, let's say, I don't know, 2 to 5%, depending on you count, but doesn't matter. It still has a big impact because in the end, what we deliver is being delivered. So when you look at that thing, technology is not an issue in the sense of technology is not developed. So electric vehicles, hydrogen, it's all developed. But now you come to reality. How much is it developed? How much infrastructure is there? And then you come to a point I've also seen and heard it quite a few times already this week. Okay, so how do you get started with that? Wouldn't it be perfect if we had all Europe everywhere running with electric and hydrogen vehicles? But the infrastructure is not there. So what the thing is, on the other hand, we have topics where we can already build on. We have a very good rail system. Theoretically, there's issues with construction, whatever, but we have a pretty good rail system available. So it's also about the modalities. So what we are doing is, okay, we can have a shuttle, let's say an electric shuttle on the first leg, then have, let's say, a long train running, and then the last leg will also be an electric shuttle, or even working with barges. Barges have maybe the prejudice, they're not sustainable. But when you look at the fuel, that's what it makes the difference. If you have a modern barges, and we just launched some new barges together with a partner, yes, they run on diesel, but they are most sufficient diesel electric engines, and the CO2 per ton transported is about half of what it is for a truck. And they are hydrogen ready. So we could have waited again and for hydrogen structure to be available, but on the other hand, those barges allow us already to lower the carbon footprint, and they can be turned into hydrogen very simply. And on top of it, and that's why I chose this example, actually they have new designs. These are barges who are very flexible on high and low water. And anytime you talk about a river report, either the water is too high or it's too low. It's never perfect. And then you have to reduce the payload, which again hurts your carbon footprint. So we can maximize the payload on these barges. So we are, let's say, addressing that at the same time so we can have full load. So that's just something to say, it's not the solution yet where we want to be, but it's getting started and then developing further. That's a very important approach.
And generating those efficiencies by obviously getting a higher payload is the kind of solution a supply chain manager would love, as well as happening to be some of the most sustainable option. Great, thank you so much. I also, at some point, or maybe we can just talk about it now. So I'll come back to it. Kevin, just one moment. I'm very curious, particularly when we talk about closing the link on the material itself, and when we're talking about reconstituting recycled polymers, for example, which is already a relatively energy-intensive activity. Does this sort of reconstitution of recycled plastics, is that equally or more energy-intensive? What is that process like in terms of its own emissions footprint? Do you see what I mean?
Not 100%. Okay. Sorry.
So you talked about, for example, you taking the foam, recycled sort of polymers that might come in the form of foam, and then reconstituting them, right, in the recycling process that you go through. Is that process itself, reconstituting already used polymers, in the case of foam, for example, is that as energy intensive, more or less, than the original production process?
Oh, okay. Thank you. Now, it is less because you're taking several steps out. I don't want to go into the chemistry details here, but in order to make one of our raw materials, we're buying a product, let's say from the petro industry, and it's 4, 5, 6 plants in between before you really get to the product that our customers buy. And that's still not the final product, because then they need 2 components and then they foam it, let's say for the mattress or in the refrigerator, let's say. But we don't go to the original product back because that would be mechanically, but we only get one step before that. So we're cutting out 3 process steps in the front and the raw material, and because we keep the carbon into the system. And again, those plants will be fed also with renewable energy. So we're not adding more energy or more carbon footprint on top of that. So it also saves that. But the biggest topic is to keep the carbon into the system. Now, a lot of people talk about decarbonization. If you decarbonize, we all disappear. As long as we keep the carbon in the system, it's not a problem. The carbon that escapes as CO2, that's the problem we need to talk about.
Fabulous. Thanks so much. Kevin, we'll come up to you. Very different kinds of materials. Obviously, you're an association. You've been very stuck in to metrics recently, which we heard about already. Can you tell us a little bit about your case?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity to be here, and it's great to talk with such a distinguished panel. So I work with the Leather and Hide Council of America, and we have been involved in leather supply chain for over 100 years. What we're looking at now is, what are some of the opportunities to really identify what is our footprint and how can we change it. I'd like to start out kind of just by clarifying a couple things, kind of put some things in context. One question I get once in a while is, are there leather farms? I promise you there are no leather farms. That hides are a byproduct of the dairy and meat industry. So it is a byproduct, and if it isn't used, it goes into landfill. The other thing I think for context is that, in fact, about 40% of hides worldwide go into landfill. So to give you a little piece of that, that's each hide has about 300 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions. You start adding that together, and that's 40 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions every year. So it's an industry which is very diffuse, very dispersed, and it's really on the land. But as you start to aggregate things, these are big numbers. One of the challenges is how do companies like the ones here evaluate different materials? How do they compare this material from that material? And there isn't a lot of transparency or visibility into how materials are analyzed and which ones are better. There are a couple of materials indexes that are out there. It turns out that they're not using transparent data, and they're not using the same methodologies for all the materials, and at the same time they're putting all the materials on a list and saying, we've indexed them and these are the best ones and these are the worst ones. And the indexes often find that natural products have the highest environmental impact. And so we've been looking at that and trying to figure out, well, what is the underlying life cycle assessment, if you will, for these products, to try to understand why is it that these natural products, which are renewable, unlike fossil fuels, are somehow coming out as being the most environmentally damaging. So that's kind of the challenge. And what we did is to hire some life cycle assessment experts to begin to build that data set. As I mentioned, the data is not transparent, so we had to go out and find our own data. So we collected data from field, so the animals, all the way through to the tanning. So really we're getting field to material. And then we began to calculate the data and look at the key factors that are involved in there. So global warming potential, eutrophication, fossil fuel use, chemistry, and the water scarcity. So how much water are you using? And what we found is that, in fact, in the case of some of these impact categories, the materials indexes are overstating the numbers that we're actually finding on the ground by 8,000 times. So if you do that, you're really saying, oh, well, this is environmentally poor product, but you're incentivizing using products which are not actually as environmentally friendly. So we're at this point. We've actually got a press release out to look at the preliminary data, and you're welcome to stop by. We've got a booth here, so feel free to stop by. Love to talk to you about that. But I think the key part of it is how do we've done the United States, and then we've looked at, so United States for hides, and then we've looked at tanning in Asia and Latin America. But we know that if we don't have the same metric in every place, then everybody ends up with the same, with a different number, and it's my number is better than your number, and we're all racing to the bottom, but the numbers don't mean anything, and consumers, whether it's the brand and retailer, or someone, the end consumer, or someone along the supply chain, aren't going to really be able to make decisions based on the numbers that are available. So We have reached out. We're working with the major hide producers to partner with them to come up with what do hides from different geographies look like, and to look at tanning data from a variety of sources, a variety of countries, to really get the deep dive. We'd love to work with manufacturers and brands and retailers to help them understand their supply chain and build that understanding of, leather is not the only material, but let's make sure we make decisions based on the best data available.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously, to some degree, we're talking about things like plastic, things like leather. I mean, these are competitors in some applications, right? And certainly getting the numbers right and making sure they include things that they might not already, like microfiber contamination or biodiversity, is certainly important. My question would just be, do those kinds of comparisons that you see, for example, among the regional tanners and hide producers, do those help you to actually see best practices and improve your own chain rather than just, you know what I mean? Rather than just have better data, how is that causing you to act?
Yeah, so I think that's the one of the important questions, because a life cycle assessment, the intention of the life cycle assessment is really to figure out what your hotspots are and what you can do about it. So as an association, we don't have, actual facilities that we're trying to work on, but what we can do by providing baseline data and then being able to slice it so that you're looking at different geographies, you're looking at different production techniques, whether it's, this kind of tanning or that kind of tanning, or, cattle that are raised in this kind of environment or that kind of environment, dairy cattle versus range-fed versus feed-finished. All of these things, they do have impact, and where it comes from. We believe that we can help both identify where your hotspots are, where you can improve your production technologies, where you can improve your practices, as well as help brands and retailers figure out how they want to affect their supply chains. Companies that have the capacity to invest in their supply chain, by all means, we think that they should be not diverting away from challenging problems, but actually investing in the supply chain to improve, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's deforestation, whether it's ensuring chemical use is appropriate, safe, and non-contaminating.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting, we've talked a lot about the supply chain. We think about producers, but I think it came up a few times, the importance of the consumer and the user, who might traditionally be at the end of the supply chain. Maybe now they're somewhere in the middle, and that leads me to the question of how much does either consumer behavior change have to be part of this equation. And I think maybe, Eva, you talked a little bit about things like a rental model or encouraging people, what they do with some of those sportswear products, for example, at the end of their life. And I'm also thinking about, Natalia, how this comes into sort of your business. What is sort of I wouldn't say the onus, but what's the role of behavior change and the consumer behavior change in this circular model that you have?
It's essential, I would say, and to only address product design and circularity there, when you can address volumes produced and consumed and lifestyles enabled. I mean, those are the three that we have identified that we can have an impact on, and then we should. It's both a responsibility and an opportunity for us.
And I mean, does circularity, is it a big selling point, for example? Do you find consumers reacting? I mean, is there a demand signal here? Anyone, please, it's open.
I think of it as the way we need to do business. We can't be selling circularity or selling sustainability. We have to be sustainable. Ultimately, consumers don't buy food products because this one's safer than that one. We understand that it's a pre-competitive requirement, and that's really where we need to go in terms of the business of sustainability.
I think So I'm of two minds about it, if I can be fully honest about it. I think on one hand, does anyone here know Lee Iacocca, who talked about people want efficiency and they'll pay any price for it? I think sustainability to a large degree is sort of the opposite of that. Everyone wants sustainability as long as it's free. And you see that in the markets that exist for green premiums. I think steel is probably doing something interesting there. Cement is struggling. I think they're giving away their green cement for free, or trying to anyway. And when I look at battery materials or the products that at Umicore we're delivering to our customers who are not the end user, right? It has everything to do with where the consumer is and what they're willing to pay for. And making those additional choices of supplying in a specific way, of having higher recycled content or 100 recycled content, right? These are additional decisions that carry an additional cost, right? And as long as the alternative exists, well, we're talking about lifestyle choices, right? And not everyone can today afford or want necessarily to choose that lifestyle. So because we're a business to business, we're sort of twice removed from consumer behavior. I think consumer behavior is massively important, but we're sort of further up the chain there.
I think we have a fundamental problem, and that is price is still the primary determinant for most individuals in terms of what they will buy. Speed is the next determinant. Quality may be at the same par as speed, but sustainability is not the primary consideration for a purchase today. I think one of the other panelists was indicating that it's perhaps generational, that we're starting to see the younger generation become more conscious consumers in terms of aligning their purchase power with their beliefs and their ethical morals and their expectations on the organization. It is not significant enough for organizations to change their supply chains today. And so just in time is a race to the bottom. It is not a race to the top. And just in time, it means that you need to reduce your friction costs. You need to reduce all elements of inefficiency in the system. And it's a hard argument to make that you ought to invest in more circularity and more sustainability and charge more to the consumer when they won't pay for it. And so to your point, I think we have this duality here today that everybody wants to invest in it. It's the right thing to do, but will the consumer pay for it? Make that bet. And what company is willing to make that bet today? I think there are a number of companies that are on the bleeding edge in terms of, yeah, it's the right thing to do, and we're going to commit to this kind of supply chain. I would say that probably 80+% of the companies are going to have to be dragged into this. They're not going to go willingly.
Well, Hanno, please.
Yeah, I would 100% agree. I'm totally with you that we're not there where we need to be. On the other hand, sorry to say, I mean, we are willing to pay. We are willing to pay, whether it's for certain coffees or for our cell phones or whatever. We are willing to pay if we see value. And we define usually what value is. There's no intrinsic value, but the value is whatever you consider to be value, whether your coffee is 4.50 or 50 cents. So in that sense, we see that. But of course, we are also B2B. So we need those companies to be front runners. And we have front runners doing that, and they're labeling that. Even with our material, it would be totally, usually, I don't know, if you buy a mattress, if you look, there's Covestro inside. You don't look for it, of course, because you might not even know. But of course, people start to say, okay, there's a recycling content with the mass balance, 10, 20, 50, whatever. People start to change their minds, and especially for longer lasting materials, they do start change their minds, and then they're willing to do that. But it's a process. But we need those front runners, us facing you as, or all of us as customers, and making that change, because we can provide it there. So,
but we're confusing the customer. We're confusing the customer today. Try to find any traceability on your packaging today in terms of where the product came from, how it was manufactured, how it was delivered. And we have different labeling standards on different countries. We have different expectations in terms of what traceability is to the consumer. And I think this is part of the challenge is we don't have an informed consumer. We've made it very difficult for the consumers to understand what sustainability is and what it defines relative to their purchasing power. I think that's part of the challenge here, is that the information that we're providing into the marketplace is not sufficient for the general consumer to say, I want to make a better buying decision about my products and my services.
But going back to the cost issue, so, very quickly, the cost issue, I think, Hanno, what I found interesting about your example, obviously, is that was one case where there was sort of like a win-win. Obviously, the most sustainable, obviously, using the barges also drives down cost, which we all really like. I think there is sort of an underlying issue here, which comes up with a lot of our discussions in the last couple of days, which is particularly for longer life cycle products or more durable products, it's about having an upfront cost, even if the life cycle cost for the user is lower. And it's really about how do you solve that sort of temporal mismatch, right, for someone for the consumer.
And I was just going to kind of reinforce that leather is usually thought of as a long, it has a long lifespan. And so we've been leaning into talking about, with consumers, about slow fashion, so that you can buy these shoes I've had for 30 years. They still look great. There's no tennis shoes, I've been through hundreds of tennis shoes in that time, because of the kind of durability. Talking to consumers about that is important because they will see that as value. But right now our labeling system doesn't help that, because we're looking at different products. If you look at this leather versus the plastic that might be used to take it, it's a material index based on the material, doesn't amortize the time value of use. And so that's another area that we need to look into.
Okay, Eva, sorry, please.
No, I totally agree. There's a lot of systemic challenges still and hurdles, like pricing on sustainable materials and circular materials and solutions. But the opportunity lies in creating products that are more attractive, or solutions that are more attractive and convenient. And that is how I think that we had our first circular product in 2006. There was no interest in that back then, of course, from a consumer perspective. But making a superior product, there's always interest in that. And there's opportunity there.
You can feel the quality.
Yeah, and I think that that is part of the circularity innovation process now, where there's a lot of exploration to do and actually advance and cater to the needs and desires of customers.
Great. We're just nearing the end of the time, but I would like to take at least one question. We have a few here that have come from the audience. But I'm thinking maybe on the line that we're here talking about customers, this is really about clients in the industry sector, right? So we're talking about sort of more B2B clients. Which examples for working with clients in the industry sector to reduce carbon footprint within category 11 of scope 3, which is the use of products? Do we have maybe Natalia?
Sure. Well, for us, the leading example would be the automotive industry, and there, in that sense, we're very lucky because it's under a lot of pressure. No matter where in the world, it's under a lot of pressure. And after the structure of the car, the battery is where most of the carbon lies, and so that ends up directly in our sort of with us, in our relationship with our customer. And this is where I talk about ecosystems, right? You talked earlier about engaging with the supplier, and I wish we had a little bit more time so we could talk about that too, as avenues of collaboration with your customer, with your supplier, specifically towards these specific goals. What they want to be able to have the materials that they need to push their product to the market at the price that they're willing to pay. The consumer pressure in one direction or another helps, but working together, designing bespoke products that really deliver at the right sort of sustainability level and price point is really sort of the entirety of our business at Umicore, and probably.
And if there's any comments, I mean, I'm going to take prerogative and go over time. If we want to talk about the relationship with suppliers, I think it's also a very important topic.
Yeah, one nice example we've seen where it's also, let's say, public pressure or customer pressure is on the mattress market. We all know these pictures. I know also from the UK, mountains of old mattresses somewhere in the landscape. Wouldn't it be great to go away? And we've developed a process again, to not only sort, disassemble, but then also chemically dissolve and bring it back into the process. It needs the customer, of course, to demand that and also help that these mattresses end up, let's say you switch one for the other, but you see it's doable. And it's not something you do every day, no? So it's a long-term item. So there is good forefront behavior, and we're positive that this is developing.
Great. We are unfortunately, please, Eva, yes.
One good thing about circularity in that perspective is it cultivates relations rather than only focusing on transactions.
Yeah.
So there's collaboration in every direction. And we have chosen to have a very small supply chain or tight supply chain in order for us to educate each other and set common goals. And that's also, I think, part of the circular transformation, so to speak, that we have to dig deeper and be qualitative in where we choose our leather from or wherever we choose. We need to know if it's a water scarce area. So it's not only about an LCA that is general for the global perspective, but rather being very, very precise.
And that information,
and relational.
And that information might be difficult to achieve. I mean, like for the customer, without sort of the right metrics or the right labeling or the right information, can be difficult to figure out.
I think from the customer perspective, we have to get rid of the lousy linear products and only supply offer good solutions. So then they can choose from their individual, desires rather than being worried about choosing something that is lousy for the environment.
Which also, I think, opens a whole talk about policy. I wish we had a lot more time on this panel, is all I can say. But unfortunately, we do have to close. I really want to thank all of you for being here. Eva Karlsson, Abe Eshkenazi, Natalia Agüeros-Macario, Hanno Bruemmer, and Kevin Latner. Thanks so much for joining me up here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.